the dust of redemption. Gulch tasted of fear and finality, a fine red powder that settled on everything from the frayed brim of a man's hat to the last hopes in his heart. On this day, as the sun bled out across the serrated peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, that dust tasted of war. They brought the warrior in, not on a horse, but slung between two, a grim pendulum marking the final desperate moments of peace. He was Cheyenne proud and powerful, yet laid low by a single perfectly placed arrow, and the man tasked with saving him was a doctor who had spent the last 5 years trying and failing to outrun the ghosts of the men he couldn't save. The town held its breath, the frontier held its breath, because everyone knew what came after an arrow like that blood fire, and a reckoning that would spare no one. The relentless Arizona sun had finally relented, surrendering the sky to the bruised purples and oranges of twilight. In the small, struggling town of Redemption, Gulch, this time of day, was usually a reprieve, a moment to draw a breath free from the oppressive heat. But not tonight. Tonight the air was thick with a tension that was colder than any desert evening. Dr. Silas Croft felt it in the marrow of his bones, a familiar dread that tasted like gunpowder and iron. He stood in the doorway of his modest infirmary, which also served as his home, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of a weary hand. Silas was a man etched by his past. His face, though not yet old, was a road map of hardship, with lines around his eyes that spoke less of laughter and more of long nights spent staring into the abyss. His hands, once steady enough to perform the most delicate surgeries on the battlefields of the Civil War, now carried a faint tremor, a physical manifestation of the memories that haunted his sleep. He had come west to escape the ghosts of Gettysburg, the fields of screaming men he'd failed to piece back together. He'd sought anonymity in the dust and cactus, hoping to practice a quiet, simple medicine of setting bones and delivering babies. The thunder of approaching hooves shattered the fragile peace. It wasn't the steady rhythmic canter of a posse or the slow plod of a prospector's mule. This was frantic, a sound of pure desperation. 2 riders from the Bar K Ranch, their faces pale under layers of trail dust, burst into the main street, their horses lathered and wild-eyed. Between them, slung across a makeshift litter, tied between their saddles, was the cause of their panic. A man. An Indian warrior, his powerful physique rendered helpless. His bare chest sculpted by a life lived under the open sky, was marred by the feathered shaft of an arrow lodged just below his collarbone at a wicked angle. His long black hair was matted with sweat and dirt, and his buckskin leggings were dark with what Silas knew was his own blood. Dr. Croft, one of the cowhands, a young man named Billy Flint, yelled, his voice cracking. We found him by the creek bed, just like this. The town emptied into the street. Sheriff Miles Beaumont, a man whose formidable gut and walrus mustache belied a sharp and cautious mind, was the first to arrive. He pushed through the gathering crowd of shopkeepers, saloon girls and drifters, his hand resting instinctively on the Colt peacemaker at his hip. What in tarnation is this? Billy Beaumont demanded, his eyes fixed on the warrior. Cheyenne Sheriff found him not a mile from Kane's new fence line. The other ranch hand, an older man named Jebediah, said, dismounting. He was still breathing. We figured we had to bring him here. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. Cheyenne. Their territory began just beyond the creek. A fragile, unspoken truce had held for years, a truce brokered on mutual avoidance. This arrow shattered it. Silas pushed forward his professional instincts, overriding his personal dread. Bring him inside, now. Lay him on the operating table. The cowhands, clumsy in their haste, carried the warrior into the infirmary. The scent of pine antiseptic and carbolic acid was immediately overwhelmed by the metallic tang of fresh blood and the earthy smell of the wounded man. Silas lit 2 more kerosene lamps, the flickering light casting long dancing shadows across the small room. He leaned in close, his practiced eyes assessing the damage. The warrior was young, perhaps 25. His face, even in unconsciousness, was a mask of stoic pride. The skin around the wound was alarmingly inflamed. The arrow shaft was Pawnee. Silas knew the markings well, the distinctive black and white fletching the way the sinew was wrapped. The Pawnee were the sworn enemies of the Cheyenne. This was not just an attack. It was a deliberate provocation. "Get me boiled water-clean cloths and the whiskey from my cabinet," the good stuff, Silas ordered Billy, who stood frozen in the doorway. "And Jebediah, go fetch Abigail Monroe. Tell her it's urgent. Tell her it's a Cheyenne warrior." Jebediah nodded, his face grim, and hurried out. Abigail. If anyone could navigate this treacherous situation, it was her. The daughter of a white fur trader and a Cheyenne woman, she walked in both worlds, but belonged fully to neither. She was the town's only translator, a bridge between 2 cultures that were perpetually on the verge of collision. As Silas gently cut away the buckskin shirt around the wound, Sheriff Beaumont filled the doorway, his bulk blocking out the fading light. "What's the verdict, Doc?" he asked, his voice low. "The verdict is that this is bad, Miles. Real bad," Silas replied, not looking up. "The arrow is deep. Looks like it missed the lung, but it's lodged against the clavicle. If I pull it, the arrowhead, it's barbed, they always are, will tear the subclavian artery. He'll bleed out in minutes. So you leave it in. If I leave it in infection or poison, we'll kill him by morning. See this discoloration? The tip was likely dipped in something nasty. Rattlesnake venom, maybe something worse." Silas looked up, his tired eyes meeting the sheriff's. "My only chance is to cut him open, clamp the artery, and try to work the head out from the inside. It's a 1 in 100 shot, and that's if I had a proper surgical theater and 2 assistants. Here with a bottle of whiskey for anesthetic, and you for an assistant." He let the sentence hang in the air. Beaumont chewed on his mustache. "And if he dies on my table," Silas said, his voice barely a whisper, "his people will see it as an execution. They'll see a Cheyenne warrior shot with a Pawnee arrow, brought to a white man's town only to die. They won't wait for explanations, Miles. They'll burn Redemption Gulch to the ground before the sun comes up." The silence that followed was heavier than any spoken word. Outside, the first faint, rhythmic pulse began. It was a sound that started not in the ears, but in the chest, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very foundations of the wooden buildings. A drum. Then another joined it, slightly offbeat, creating a menacing, heart-like cadence. Billy Flint stumbled back into the room, his face ashen. "Doctor, Sheriff, they're here, on the ridge, an army of them." Silas closed his eyes for a brief moment, the ghosts of Gettysburg swirling in the lamplight. He had come west to escape war, to heal simple wounds and forget the complexities of men killing men. But war had followed him. It had found him in this dusty, forgotten town and laid itself out on his operating table, its life hanging by the thinnest of threads. The drumbeat grew louder, a steady, inexorable promise of the violence to come. The sun was gone now. The long, dark night had just begun. The drumming was a living thing. It crawled in through the cracks in the walls, seeped up through the floorboards, and echoed in the hollow space of Silas's chest. It was the sound of a gathering storm, of a patience worn thin. On the ridge overlooking Redemption Gulch, dozens of pinprick fires had bloomed in the darkness, silent testaments to the number of warriors who now watched the town. They weren't attacking. Not yet. They were waiting. Abigail Munro arrived like a gust of wind, pushing past the nervous townsfolk clustered outside the infirmary. She was a woman of stark contrasts. She wore a simple calico dress, but moved with the quiet grace of a hunter. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of grey, held both the sharp intelligence of her father's people and the ancient, earthy wisdom of her mother's. Her dark hair was braided in the Cheyenne fashion, a silent declaration of her heritage. She took in the scene at a glance, the unconscious warrior on the table, the grim-faced doctor, the anxious sheriff. Her gaze lingered on the wounded man, and a flicker of recognition of sorrow crossed her face. "Keme," she whispered, her voice soft but clear. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the fletching of the arrow. "Son of Chief Blackwood." The name landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. They hadn't just found a random warrior. They had the son of the most powerful and respected chief in the territory. His father will be leading the men on that ridge. Abigail stated her voice, flat, devoid of emotion. It was a statement of fact, not speculation. They will not leave without him. Alive or dead. Sheriff Beaumont swore under his breath, running a hand over his bald head. "This just gets better and better. What do they want, Abby?" "They want justice," she said, her grey eyes locking with the sheriff's. "And they want his life. For now they are offering us a chance to give it back. But their patience is not infinite." As if on cue, a single rider detached from the group on the ridge, carrying a torch that cut a blazing orange gash through the night. He rode slowly, deliberately down the incline and stopped at the edge of town, just beyond the light of the saloon's lanterns. He was a magnificent, imposing figure, his face painted in grim lines, a full eagle feather headdress marking him as a man of immense authority. Chief Blackwood. "He wants to parley Beaumont," said, squaring his shoulders. "Abby, you're with me. Doc, you stay here. You keep that boy breathing." Silas could only nod his attention, already consumed by his patient. Keme's breathing was growing shallow, his skin taking on a feverish heat. The poison or the infection was spreading. Time was a luxury he no longer had. Outside the confrontation, unfolded under the nervous gaze of the entire town. Abigail's voice carried clearly in the tense silence, first in the fluid, guttural syllables of the Cheyenne language, then in the clipped, direct English for the sheriff. The chief's message was simple and terrifyingly clear. He knew his son had been brought to the white man's town. He did not know why he was shot, only that he was found on the edge of their land, struck down by the arrow of a Pawnee. He saw this as an act of cowardice and a potential trap. He was giving the town until midnight. At the stroke of midnight, they were to return Kem to him alive and healed. If they did, peace would hold. If they returned him dead, or did not return him at all, his warriors would descend upon the town and leave nothing but ashes and memories. When Beaumont and Abigail returned to the infirmary, the sheriff's face was a mask of grim resolve. "Midnight," he said, his voice raspy. "He gave us until midnight. That's less than 4 hours, Doc." "It's not enough time," Silas said, pressing a cool, damp cloth to Keme's forehead. "This surgery, it could take hours. I have to be slow precise. One slip and it's over." "Then you'd best be quick and precise." Beaumont retorted, his fear manifesting as anger. He began to pace the small room like a caged bear. "I've got 12 men with rifles who think they can hold off 200 warriors. I know better. We're sitting on a powder keg, and that boy on your table is the fuse." Abigail ignored the sheriff's outburst. She approached the table, her movements calm and measured. She looked at Silas, her eyes searching his. "Can you save him?" she asked, her voice low and intense. "I can try," Silas answered honestly. "The odds are not good. My mother was a healer," Abigail said, her gaze drifting back to Keem. "She taught me about herbs. There is a root, the purple cone flower. It can fight infection and the bite of a snake. It will not cure him, but it might slow the poison. It might buy you time." "Where is it?" Silas asked immediately. "I have some dried at my cabin." "It's just past the edge of town," she said. "I will be quick." "No," Beaumont interjected, stopping her with a hand on her arm. "You're not leaving this town. You're the only thing keeping that chief from giving the order right now. He will wait until midnight. Sheriff?" He gave his word, Abigail insisted, shrugging off his hand. "The life of his son is more important than his pride. But if we do nothing, that boy will die, and his word will die with him." That root could make the difference. Silas looked from the determined face of Abigail to the panicked eyes of the sheriff. She was right. Doing something, anything, was better than just waiting for the fever to consume Keme. It was a slim chance, but it was the only one they had. "Let her go." "Miles," Silas said. "We need every advantage we can get. I'll start preparing him for the surgery." Beaumont hesitated, his mustache twitching with indecision. He looked out the window at the fires on the ridge, at the silent, watching army. He was a man of law and order, a man who believed in clear lines and predictable outcomes. He was now adrift in a sea of uncertainty, with the fate of his entire town resting in the trembling hands of a haunted doctor and on the promise of an Indian chief's honor. "Fine," he grumbled, finally relenting. "But by God, Abby, you be quick about it. And you, Doc, you better be a miracle worker." Abigail was gone, in a flash, disappearing into the darkness. Beaumont turned his attention to the town. He began barking orders, positioning his small contingent of deputies and volunteers at strategic points, telling women and children to stay in the stone-built church, the most defensible building. Silas was alone with his patient, the rhythmic drumming from the ridge serving as a macabre metronome, counting down the minutes he had left. He laid out his instruments on a clean cloth, a scalpel, forceps clamps, and a bone saw, all tools he hadn't used for such a desperate purpose since the war. He poured a generous amount of whiskey onto a rag and held it near Keme's face, hoping the fumes would be enough to deepen his unconsciousness. He poured another glass for himself, the fiery liquid, doing little to steady his hands. He looked at the young warrior on his table. In Keme's face, he saw the faces of all the young soldiers, both Union and Confederate, who had died under his knife. He had fled across a continent to escape this very moment, this terrible responsibility of holding a life in his hands, with death breathing down his neck. But there was no escape. Not from the past, and not from the present. The drums rolled on a constant reminder of the price of failure. Midnight was coming. The infirmary became a bubble of intense, focused silence, a stark contrast to the growing unease in the town and the relentless drumming from the hills. The kerosene lamps hissed, casting a stark, unforgiving light on the scene. Silas Croft worked with a desperate economy of motion, the years of battlefield surgery flowing back into his hands, overriding the tremor that had plagued him for so long. He was no longer a broken man hiding in the desert. He was a surgeon, and this was his theater. Abigail returned breathless, a small leather pouch in her hand. From it, she produced dried, gnarled roots. While Silas sterilized his instruments in the boiling water, she crushed the roots with a pestle, mixing them with a little water to form a thick, dark poultice. "This will not be enough to stop it," she warned, her voice a low murmur, as she carefully applied the paste to the inflamed skin around the arrow's entry point. but it will slow the fire in his blood. It will give his spirit something to hold on to. Silas barely heard her. He was mapping the flesh and bone in his mind, visualizing the network of veins, arteries and nerves hidden beneath the skin. The subclavian artery, the great vessel that supplied blood to the arm, was his primary concern. It lay perilously close to the arrow's path. If he nicked it, Kim would be dead in under a minute. There would be no time to stop the bleeding. Abigail, I need you to hold him. No matter what happens, no matter how much he thrashes, if he wakes you, hold his shoulders down. Understood. Silas's voice was sharp, clinical. She nodded, her expression resolute. She placed her hands firmly on Keme's shoulders, her knuckles white. Sheriff Silas barked, not taking his eyes off the wound. I need you to hold that lamp steady. Right here. And if I call for an instrument, you place it in my hand. Don't hesitate. Beaumont, looking pale and sweating profusely, moved into position, the lamp's glow intensifying on the warrior's chest. The whiskey Silas had drunk had burned away the fog of his fear, leaving only a cold, sharp clarity. He took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of antiseptic and the herbal poultice filling his lungs. He made the first incision. The scalpel honed to a razor's edge, parted the skin with a sickeningly clean slice. Silas cut a wide, exploratory opening parallel to the collarbone. Blood welled up, instantly dark and sluggish. He worked quickly, using clamps to pinch off the smaller superficial bleeders, his forceps a blur as he delved deeper, parting layers of muscle and fascia. The room was silent, save for Keme's ragged breaths, the hiss of the lamps, and the steady, distant thrum of the drums. It felt like the entire world had shrunk to this single point of light, to this desperate struggle between life and death being waged on a rough-hewn wooden table. Forceps Silas grunted. Beaumont slapped the cold steel into his palm. He probed the wound, feeling for the foreign object. His fingers brushed against the hard, unyielding shape of the arrowhead, lodged tight against the underside of the clavicle. Just as he'd feared. It was wedged in place. Worse, he could feel the faint, terrifying pulse of the subclavian artery beating directly against the arrow's razor-sharp edge. Every beat of Keme's heart was a gamble, pushing the artery against the instrument of his death. Silas knew then that he couldn't simply pull the arrow out, even from this angle. The slightest movement could cause the barb to slice into the arterial wall. His initial plan was unworkable. A wave of cold despair washed over him. The men on the ridge were not waiting for a surgery. They were waiting for an execution. "Damn it," he whispered, pulling back. He stared at the wound, his mind racing, searching for another option, another path he hadn't considered. The ghosts of Gettysburg were whispering in his ear, again telling him it was hopeless that this man was already dead. He looked at the part of the arrow shaft still protruding from Keme's chest. It was made of dogwood, scraped smooth. The fletching 3 hawk feathers was tied with sinew, Pawnee without a doubt. Or was it something felt wrong? It was almost too perfect, too much like a textbook example of a Pawnee arrow. Then he saw it. A small detail he had missed in his initial haste, the sinew wrapping the feathers. It was tied with a specific knot, a double constrictor knot. He'd seen it before. The U.S. cavalry used a similar knot for securing bedrolls and gear. Pawnee warriors and most other tribes he knew of used a series of simple, tight half-hitches. It was a small thing, a tiny discrepancy, but in Silas's hyper-focused state it screamed at him. And the shaft itself, it was almost perfectly straight, perfectly uniform. Most tribal arrows were made by hand, showing slight imperfections. This looked like it had been turned on a lathe. "Abigail," he said, his voice tight with a new dawning suspicion. "Look at this arrow. Look closely at the shaft and the knot on the fletching." Abigail leaned in her keen eyes, examining the details. She frowned, her brow furrowing in concentration. "The feathers are Pawnee style," she said slowly. "But the wood, it is too smooth. And this is not how our people, or the Pawnee, tie their fletching. This is the work of a white man trying to make an arrow look like a Pawnee's. The implication hit them both at the same time. This wasn't an act of war between tribes. This was a setup. Someone had deliberately shot the son of a Cheyenne chief with a forged Pawnee arrow near a white man's town to ignite a war on two fronts. A war that would engulf Redemption Gulch and pit the Cheyenne against the U.S. Army, who would surely be called in to deal with the uprising. Kane Beaumont breathed from behind the lamp, the name hanging in the air like poison smoke. Bartholomew Kane, the wealthy rancher who owned the Bar-K, the man whose land bordered Cheyenne territory, the man who had been trying for years to get the government to remove the tribe so he could gain access to the silver-rich streams on their land. A war would be the perfect cover. The Cheyenne would be blamed driven off their land or exterminated, and Kane would be free to claim it all. The two cowhands who had found Keme, they worked for Kane. The revelation was horrifying, but it changed nothing about the immediate problem. Keme was still dying on the table. The drums were still beating. Midnight was still approaching. But now, a sliver of hope ignited in Silas's mind. He had a new, incredibly risky idea. It was a madman's gambit, a procedure he had only ever read about, designed for removing deeply embedded shrapnel. "Sheriff, I need the bone saw," Silas said, his voice now ringing with a terrifying certainty. "And I need you to hold him down. Both of you." Beaumont's eyes widened. "The saw. What in God's name, for I can't pull the arrowhead out. The artery is in the way," Silas explained, his eyes blazing with fierce intensity. "So I'm not going to. I'm going to go through the bone," he pointed with the tip of his scalpel. "I'm going to saw through a section of his clavicle. Remove a piece of the bone entirely. That will give me the space I need to get behind the arrowhead and dislodge it without touching the artery. Then I can pull the shaft out the way it came." "You're insane, Beaumont," whispered, horrified. "You'll cripple him for life. He will live." Silas countered, his voice like iron. "A crippled arm is better than a grave. It's the only way. Now give me the saw." The surgeon's gamble was no longer just about saving a life. It was about exposing a lie, about stopping a war before it could begin. The fate of hundreds of people now rested on his ability to perform a butchery that might just pass for a miracle. He took the saw from the sheriff's trembling hand, the cold steel a heavy weight of responsibility, and turned back to his patient. The drums outside seemed to beat faster, urging him on toward midnight. The rasp of the bone saw against Keme's clavicle was a horrific, grating sound that set everyone's teeth on edge. Silas worked with a grim, sweat-soaked focus, his world narrowed to the small, bloody field of the incision. He had to be precise. Too deep, and he could sever the very artery he was trying to save. Too shallow, and he wouldn't be able to remove the bone section. Abigail held Kem steady, her face, a pale, stoic mask, whispering what sounded like prayers or reassurances in the Cheyenne tongue. Sheriff Beaumont, his face the color of wet parchment, kept the lamp steady, his eyes wide, with a mixture of horror and awe. Finally, with a sickening crack, the section of collarbone came free. Silas carefully lifted the piece of bone out with forceps and placed it on the side table, a bloody trophy of his desperate gambit. The space it created was just enough. He could now see the dull glint of the barbed arrowhead nestled perilously against the pulsing blue wall of the subclavian artery. He exchanged the saw for a delicate pair of forceps. This was the most dangerous moment. With the steadiness of a watchmaker, he reached into the wound. He could feel the faint tremor in his fingers returning and willed it away. He gripped the back of the arrowhead, carefully disengaging the barbs from the muscle tissue where they had snagged. One by one, the seconds stretched into eternities. The drums outside seemed to fade into a dull, distant roar as all of his concentration focused on the tip of that instrument. Then it was free. The arrowhead was no longer touching the artery. "All right, Abigail," Silas said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I'm going to pull the shaft out now. It's going to hurt him even in this state. Hold tight." He moved to the other side of the table, took a firm grip on the feathered shaft and pulled. It came out with a grotesque sucking sound. He immediately dropped it and lunged back to the wound, ready to apply pressure, expecting a geyser of blood. But the artery held. The bleeding was no worse than it had been before. A collective shuddering sigh of relief went through the room. The most dangerous part was over. Now he just had to clean the wound and stitch him up, a task that, while difficult, was blessedly routine compared to what he had just done. As Silas began the meticulous work of suturing, Sheriff Beaumont picked up the bloody arrow shaft, examining it under the lamplight. "So this is what's going to start a war," he muttered, turning it over in his hands. "A cheap forgery. It would have worked." Abigail said, her voice strained. She hadn't relaxed her grip on Kem's shoulders. "By morning, my people would have attacked the town. The army from Fort Grant would have been called in. They would ride to the Pawnee Reservation to retaliate for the attack. By the time anyone figured out the truth, if they ever did, the war would have a life of its own. And Kane would have what he wants." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Kane's cowhands, Billy Flint and Jebediah, hadn't just stumbled upon Kem. They were part of the plan. They had either shot him themselves or worked with the man who did. Bringing him to the White Doctor was a particularly insidious part of the scheme. If Keme died here, the Cheyenne would blame the town, ensuring the conflict started exactly where Kane needed it to. If by some miracle Keme lived, Kane could simply deny everything his men, the heroes, who tried to save the poor warrior. He would win either way. The cowhands Beaumont growled, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. "Where are they? Last I saw, Billy was at the saloon telling everyone what a hero he was," Silas said, not looking up from his needlework. "Jebediah is probably with him." Not for long, the sheriff said, his hand dropping to his pistol. He was a man transformed. The cautious, indecisive politician was gone, replaced by the hardened lawman he had once been. "I'm going to go have a talk with those two. We need a confession. We need proof to show Chief Blackwood." "They won't talk, Miles," Silas countered, tying off a suture. "They're Kane's men. He pays them well to keep their mouths shut." "Everyone talks when the alternative is a rope," Beaumont said grimly. "But you're right, it's not enough. We need more than the word of two coerced cowards." He began to pace again, the floorboards groaning under his weight. "How does Kane run his operation? How does he get his messages out, coordinate something like this? He's smart, careful. He wouldn't use riders for sensitive information. They can be caught." The question hung in the air. Silas, concentrating on his work, almost didn't register it. But then a memory surfaced. 2 days ago, a man had come to his infirmary to get a deep gash on his forearm stitched up. A stranger, not from the town, a hard-looking man with cold eyes and a fancy tooled leather gun belt. He'd said he was a surveyor for the railroad. While Silas was stitching him up, he'd noticed the man's quiver of arrows leaning against the wall. He'd idly remarked on it, and the man had grunted that he liked to hunt on his travels. Silas remembered the fletching, black and white hawk feathers, and he remembered the perfectly uniform lathe-turned shafts. "The telegraph," Silas said, suddenly looking up at Beaumont. "There's a surveyor in town." Or at least he calls himself one. He's one of Kane's hired guns. I stitched him up 2 days ago. He had a quiver full of arrows just like this one. Abigail's eyes lit up with understanding. The telegraph office. It's the only way to send a coded message quickly and secretly. Kane could have sent word to this man to carry out the attack, and he could be using the wire to send news of the Indian uprising to the army right now to make sure they ride in. The telegraph operator, Elias Vance Beaumont, said, his eyes narrowing. Quiet little man. Always keeps to himself. No one would ever suspect him. The tangled thread of the conspiracy was rapidly unraveling, revealing a pattern of deception that was more audacious and dangerous than they could have imagined. It wasn't just an assassination attempt. It was a carefully orchestrated plot to manipulate factions and governments, all for a strip of silver-rich land. Silas finished the last stitch, bandaging the wound tightly. Keme's breathing was steadier now, deeper. The poultice and the removal of the poisoned arrowhead seemed to be working. His fever hadn't broken, but it hadn't worsened. He was stable for now. "I'm finished here," Silas said, stripping off his blood-stained gloves. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was 10:30. They had less than 90 minutes until midnight. He's alive. But showing Chief Blackwood a living son and a doctored arrow isn't enough. He'll see it as a trick. We need undeniable proof of the conspiracy. We need the telegraph. Sheriff Beaumont nodded, his decision made. "All right. Abby, you stay here. You watch over Kim. If he wakes up, you keep him calm. Doc, you're with me." Silas felt a jolt of apprehension. "Me, Miles. I'm a doctor, not a lawman. You're the only other person in this town I know for a fact I can trust right now." Beaumont said, his gaze hard as granite. "And you're the one who saw the gunman. Vance knows you. He might not be as suspicious if you show up with me. Now grab your coat. We're going to pay a late-night visit to Mr. Vance, and we're going to find out just what kind of messages he's been sending." The telegraph office was a small, unassuming, clapboard building at the far end of the main street, wedged between the general store and the assayer's office. It was dark, save for a single sliver of yellow light escaping from under the front door. The rhythmic clatter of the telegraph key, usually a constant and comforting sound of connection to the outside world, was conspicuously silent. Sheriff Beaumont and Silas Croft approached with caution, sticking to the shadows of the wooden boardwalk. The air had grown colder, and the drumming from the ridge seemed to have taken on a more insistent, impatient rhythm. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. "You knock," Beaumont whispered, gesturing with his pistol. "Act normal. Say you need to send an urgent message to Fort Grant about medical supplies. I'll be right behind you." Silas's heart hammered against his ribs. This was a far cry from the quiet anonymity he had sought. He smoothed down his coat, took a deep breath, and stepped into the faint light spilling from the doorway. He raised his hand and knocked firmly. For a moment there was no response. Then the sound of shuffling from within. The door opened a crack, and the sallow, bespectacled face of Elias Vance peered out. Vance was a small, mousy man with thinning hair and ink stains on his fingers. He looked perpetually nervous, a disposition that had always seemed suited to his meticulous job. Dr. Croft Vance asked, his voice a reedy quaver. "It's awfully late," Elias Silas said, forcing a calm tone. "Apologies for the hour. I have an urgent message I need to send to the army surgeon at Fort Grant. We've had a medical emergency. I'm running dangerously low on laudanum and surgical thread." Vance's eyes darted past Silas into the darkness behind him. "An emergency? With the trouble on the ridge related, yes?" Silas said. "May I come in?" Vance hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. In that moment of indecision, Beaumont moved. He pushed the door wide open, shoving Silas inside ahead of him and leveling his Colt at the terrified operator. "Evening, Elias the Sheriff," said his voice, a low growl. "We need to have a look at your message log for the past few days." The office was small and cluttered, smelling of ozone ink and stale coffee. A green-visored lamp cast a pool of light on the telegraph key and a stack of papers. On a small cot in the corner, another figure was stirring, rising with a curse. It was the surveyor the man Silas had stitched up. His right arm was in a sling, but his left hand was already reaching for the gun belt hanging on the bedpost. "Don't even think about it," Beaumont barked, swinging his pistol towards the gunman. The man froze, his eyes cold and reptilian, fixing on Silas. Well, if it ain't the good doctor," the gunman sneered. "His name was Larson, a known enforcer for hire. Should have let me bleed out, I suppose." "I'm beginning to agree," Silas retorted, his fear giving way to a cold anger. Beaumont kept his gun on Larson, while Silas moved to the desk. He quickly shuffled through the flimsy message slips. Most were mundane orders for the general store messages between families' mining reports. But then he found it, a series of messages sent over the last 3 days, all coded with a simple numerical cipher, and all addressed to a BK at the Bar K Ranch. Below them were copies of outgoing messages, also in code, addressed to the commander at Fort Grant. "Miles, look at this," Silas said, holding up the slips. Vance lunged suddenly, not with aggression, but with a desperate, panicked energy. He tried to snatch the papers, but Beaumont shoved him back with his free arm, sending him sprawling into a stack of boxes. "It's not what you think," Vance squeaked from the floor, his glasses askew. "Mr. Kane. He just pays me to keep him informed of army movements for his cattle business. Is that what he calls it?" Beaumont said, kicking a ledger book toward Silas. "Check the payments ledger, Doc. See what his information is worth." Silas opened the book. Alongside the regular small payments for messages, there were 3 large recent cash deposits logged under private contracts, totaling $500. An astronomical sum for a small-town telegraph operator. $500, Elias, Silas said, looking at the cowering man. "That's more than you make in a year. What kind of information is worth that much?" While their attention was focused on Vance, Larson made his move. With surprising speed, he kicked the cot into Beaumont's legs, knocking the big sheriff off balance. In the same motion, he grabbed his pistol and fired. The shot was deafening in the small room. The bullet tore through the wooden wall, missing Beaumont by inches. Silas reacted on pure instinct, grabbing the heavy inkwell from the desk and hurling it at Larson. It struck the gunman in the face, showering him with black ink. He staggered back, momentarily blinded, and that was all the opening Beaumont needed. The sheriff, roaring with rage, brought the barrel of his Colt down on Larson's wrist. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and Larson's pistol clattered to the floor. Beaumont followed through with a punch that sent the hired gun crashing into the wall, where he slid to the floor unconscious. Beaumont stood over him, breathing heavily, before turning his furious gaze back to Vance, who was trying to crawl under the desk. The sheriff hauled him out by the collar. "All right, Elias." "No more games," Beaumont snarled, pressing the warm barrel of his pistol to the man's all-sweaty forehead. "You're going to tell us everything. You're going to tell us the code. And then you're going to write down a full confession detailing Bartholomew Kane's entire plan. Or I swear to God, the Cheyenne on that ridge will be the least of your worries." Under the threat of imminent death, Elias Vance's loyalty to Kane evaporated. Sobbing, he confessed everything. He explained the simple substitution cipher Kane used. He admitted that Larson had been sent to kill Keem, and that he, Vance, had been transmitting false reports to Fort Grant for the last hour, claiming that Redemption Gulch was under a full-scale assault by Cheyenne warriors. He was painting a picture of a savage, unprovoked attack to ensure the army would ride in with guns blazing, asking no questions. The plan was to create so much chaos that no one would ever be able to piece the truth together. "Get a pen and paper," Doc Beaumont commanded, never taking his eyes or his gun off Vance. "Our friend Elias is about to become a star witness." Silas grabbed the paper, his hands shaking, not from fear this time, but from adrenaline. He began to write as Vance dictated the man's reedy voice, spilling the details of the conspiracy. They had the proof, a signed confession, the decoded messages, a captured gunman, and the fraudulent arrow. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 20 minutes to midnight. They had the truth, but they were running out of time to use it. The drums outside were no longer just a rhythm. They were a frantic, thundering crescendo, a countdown to war. The infirmary was a tableau of suspended animation when Silas and Beaumont burst back in. Abigail was by Keme's side, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. Keme himself was stirring his head, moving from side to side, low moans escaping his lips. He was fighting his way back to consciousness. "How is he?" Silas asked, rushing to the table. "His fever is breaking," Abigail reported, her voice filled with a cautious optimism. "The medicine you gave him, the root, it is working. He is restless." Beaumont threw the signed confession and the decoded telegrams onto a small table. "We have it, Abby. The whole damn conspiracy signed and sealed by Kane's own man." He looked at the clock. 10 minutes to midnight. "But it's useless if we can't get it to the chief." The drumming from the ridge had reached a fever pitch. It was no longer a warning. It was a war cry. The warriors would be preparing their charge. Any moment now the first torch would be thrown, the first shot fired. "There's no time to ride up there and parley," Silas said, his mind racing. "They'll shoot us on sight. We need a signal." Abigail said, her eyes scanning the room, searching for a solution. Something they will understand. Something that will make them pause. Just then, a great collective shout rose from the street outside. One of Beaumont's deputies, a young man named Peterson, ran in his face, white with terror. "Sheriff, they're moving. They're coming down the ridge." Panic seized the room. This was it. The deadline had arrived. But at that exact moment, a different sound cut through the tension, a deep, shuddering gasp from the man on the table. He pulled the arrow before midnight, and the warrior opened his eyes as drums rolled outside. Keme's eyes, dark and unfocused, blinked, slowly adjusting to the lamplight. He tried to sit up, his hand going to the tightly wrapped bandage on his chest, a grunt of pain escaping his lips. "Easy now," Silas said gently, pushing him back down. "You're safe. You're in the doctor's office in Redemption Gulch." Keme's gaze shifted, finding Abigail. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. He spoke, his voice a raw, weak croak. Abigail answered him in Cheyenne, her tone soft and reassuring. He asks what happened. Abigail translated for the others. He remembers being stalked. A man who was not Indian. He was shot from the rocks. "That's our proof," Beaumont exclaimed, his own testimony. "It's not enough to stop the attack," Peterson yelled from the doorway. They're halfway down the slope. Abigail's mind was working furiously. She looked from Kem to the confession on the table to the window facing the ridge. "The fire," she said suddenly. "The signal fire." "What are you talking about?" Beaumont asked, bewildered. "Every clan has a signal, a sign for victory or for a successful hunt. For Keme's clan, it is a bright, clear fire burning alone." "It means the warrior has returned," she explained, her voice urgent. "The big bonfire in the center of town, for the Founders' Day celebration. Is it still there?" "Yes, the wood is all stacked," the sheriff confirmed. "Light it," she commanded. "Light it now." A single, huge blaze. When they see it, they will pause. It is a sign of respect, a sign they must honor. It will buy us the minutes we need. Beaumont didn't hesitate. Peterson, get every man you can find. Forget the barricades. Light the damn bonfire. The deputy scrambled out, shouting orders. As Silas and the sheriff helped Kem sit up, propping him against the wall, Abigail grabbed the fraudulent arrow, the confession, and one of the decoded telegrams. "Help me get him to the doorway," she said to Silas. "He can't be moved," Silas protested. "His wound. He must be seen," she insisted, her eyes blazing. His father will not believe a signal alone. He must see his son with his own eyes. Leaning heavily on Silas and Abigail, Kim, grimacing with every step, made his way to the infirmary door. Beaumont threw it open. The scene outside was one of controlled chaos. The town's defenders were abandoning their positions, running towards the town square with torches. In the distance, a wave of darkness, punctuated by the glint of metal and the fierce visages of painted warriors, was flowing down the hillside. Then, a great whoosh sound filled the air, and an enormous column of fire erupted in the center of town, soaring 30 feet into the sky. The bonfire, built from weeks of collected timber and dry brush, ignited with ferocious speed, casting the entire gulch in a flickering, brilliant orange light. The effect on the advancing Cheyenne was immediate and dramatic. The war cries died in their throats. The charge slowed, faltered, and then stopped. Hundreds of warriors stood frozen on the slope, their attention captured by the single roaring blaze. It was their sign, a sign that should not be coming from the heart of the white man's town. It was a message of confusion, a question mark written in fire. Into this sudden stunned silence, Abigail stepped forward onto the boardwalk, holding up her hands. She began to speak, her voice ringing out with incredible power and clarity, carrying across the unnatural quiet. She spoke in her mother's tongue, a torrent of words, explaining the deception, the treachery. Then she and Silas helped Keme into the doorway, fully visible in the firelight. A sound rippled through the Cheyenne ranks, a collective gasp of shock and disbelief. At the head of the halted war party, Chief Blackwood, who had been ready to unleash hell upon the town, stared at the sight of his living son. He raised a hand and slowly, majestically began to walk forward alone towards the light of the town, towards the son he thought he had lost. The drums had stopped. The stroke of midnight had passed in a blaze of fire and a moment of impossible truth. The war was over before its first casualty. The dawn broke clear and cold over a transformed Redemption Gulch. In the main street, the townspeople and Cheyenne warriors mingled in a cautious, unprecedented peace. After seeing the irrefutable proof of treachery, the forged arrow, the confession, and his own son's testimony, Chief Blackwood chose a new path. Valuing the truth that had saved his son, he agreed to let the law handle the conspirator. As a powerful symbol of a united front against the true enemy, he lent 10 of his warriors to Sheriff Beaumont's posse. The combined force rode to the Barkay Ranch, faced with the shocking sight of settlers, and Cheyenne riding as one Kane's hired guns quickly surrendered. Beaumont and Silas found Kane in his study. The rancher's arrogance dissolved into panicked fury when he saw the signed confession. A desperate lunge for a pistol was met by Beaumont's swift, practiced draw. A single shot shattered Kane's shoulder, ending his corrupt empire not with a war, but with a pathetic whimper on his study floor. Justice was swift. Kane, his gunman Larson, and the telegraph operator Vance were all sent to the federal prison at Yuma. The near catastrophe forged a new durable peace between the town and the tribe, solidified by a formal treaty of trade and mutual respect with Abigail Monroe as the essential bridge between them. Silas Croft finally found the redemption he had traveled a continent to seek. The ghosts of Gettysburg were gone, replaced by the quiet purpose of his work and the warmth of Abigail's companionship. Months later, a fully healed Kem rode into town and presented him with a single eagle feather dyed red at its tip. It was an honor mark, Kemi explained, for a warrior who fought not with weapons, but with knowledge the man who had saved a life, and in doing so had saved 2 peoples from the brink of destruction. And so, a single act of courage, a surgeon's desperate gamble against the clock, did more than just save one man's life. It exposed a dark conspiracy and pulled an entire region back from the brink of a bloody, senseless war. The story of Silas Croft and the warrior Kem is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't always found in the heat of battle, but in the quiet, determined pursuit of truth and healing, even when all hope seems lost. It proves that sometimes the steadiest hand and the clearest eye can be more powerful than any army. If this story of grit redemption and the unlikely bonds forged in the heart of the Old West resonated with you, then please help us share it. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it, and share this video with anyone who loves a tale of high-stakes frontier drama. Most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have many more stories from the dusty trails and forgotten towns of history to tell, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.